Hello, this is Joyce Barrett. I'm going to give participants 1 or 2 more minutes just to sign in. Hello, I'm Joyce Barrett, and I would like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Webinars are brought to you by the membership support of Heritage Ohio. Heritage Ohio's mission is to help people save the places that matter, build community, live better. Today, we will have a presentation on preserving Ohio's place in the civil rights movement. We will be taking questions throughout the presentation. You can type them into the box, and we will read those questions at the end of the presentation. Most issues with the webinar software will be solved if you close the program and restart it with the link that was sent to you. Tomorrow, we will send out the recording, and if you would like a copy of the presentation, please let us know by email. Our presenter today is Barb Powers, Department Head of Inventory and Registration at the State Historic Preservation Office. And now I will turn the presentation over to Barb.
Okay, thanks, Joyce, and welcome everyone.
Enter.
Buildings and places of our past have ways of disappearing, especially when their histories are not as self-evident as the grandiose architectural statement or a long-remembered association with a town founder or local leader. We found this out firsthand. A few years back, one of our AmeriCorps community surveyor projects set out to record African-American properties in the Cleveland neighborhood of Huff, Glenville, and elsewhere. And what was quickly discovered was that many historic properties associated with African American civil rights history that once defined these places were gone, demolished, replaced, or now just vacant lots. Borrowing a phrase calling for federal civil rights legislation in the 1960s, we felt the, quote, fierce urgency of now to develop a project to identify historic properties associated with the African American civil rights movement in Ohio and encourage nominating them to the National Register of Historic Places. So in 2017, Ohio State Historic Preservation Office, a division of the Ohio History Connection, we received a grant from the U.S. Department of Interior's National Park Service African American Civil Rights Grant Program. Our project was to research, document, and assist in the preservation of historic properties associated with African American history and the civil rights movement in Ohio during the 20th century. The results of this project we're going to talk about today. They include a National Register multiple property documentation cover, which from here on out will be referred to as the MPD, entitled African American Civil Rights Movement in Ohio, 1900 to 1970. a National Register nomination utilizing the MPD, and online guidance to successfully nominate properties to the National Register. The project was officially kicked off with a symposium at Shiloh Baptist Church, a historic Black church in Columbus. This information gathering day brought together a statewide group to discuss the history and significance of the civil rights movement and identify broad themes and important individuals and groups, along with communities, properties, and neighborhoods associated with the themes in Ohio. And it proved to be a very helpful and successful day to get us thinking about what was important in association with this topic. Okay. This is a place-based history, recognizing through listing in the National Register the actual places where the history of the civil rights movement in Ohio happened. While many of the properties may be gone, successful National Register nominations, for the most part, must include physical properties. There may be some sites that have the ability to yield important information, and in all these cases, they'll require some specialized expertise to assess their qualifications for the National Register. But rest assured, there are plenty of resources out there to be researched, recorded, and recognized. To the contrary of the experience I opened with, other AmeriCorps community surveys hosted by Cleveland Restoration Society, Columbus Landmarks Foundation, and most recently, the City of Cincinnati through the Urban Conservator's Office, discovered, which we're seeing pictured here, a post-war African-American residential subdivision, the George Washington Carver Hanford Village, that proved to be one of the first in the country funded with Federal Housing Administration loans for African-American veterans, many of them Tuskegee Airmen. A mid-century modern doctor's office built by a group of African-American physicians otherwise denied practicing privileges in many of the local hospitals. And examples of the work of African-American builders and architects in the Myrtle-Highfield Historic District in the Lee Harvard neighborhood of Cleveland. So what is the multiple property document? It is an overarching document that provides a framework for evaluating thematic groups of historic properties associated with our theme, civil rights movement in Ohio during this specific time period. So as we'll see, this cover document is organized by theme, civil rights movement, broken down into specific context, historic context or sub-themes, place, and it's a statewide focus, so it's Ohio, and then time. And we're mostly concentrating on turn of the century, 1900 through 1970s, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. What is a multiple property documentation is not, and this is very important to understand. The MPD document is not an actual nomination. Individual nominations for specific buildings, historic districts have to be then ultimately prepared and listed in the National Register. But what the MPD serves is really it's a research source that gives you information that helps facilitate those nominations. And we're going to wind up the webinar today looking at 2 case studies, which I think will help make that clear. The other thing that the MPD is not is a catch-all for nominating properties that may lack significance or historic integrity. Anything nominated to the National Register that utilizes the MPD still has to meet the National Register criteria and has to possess historic integrity. So the multiple property documentation cover document will aid in evaluating and nominating significant buildings, sites, structures, objects, and districts associated with African American efforts to gain equal rights in Ohio, as I said, during that period of 1900 to 1970. It'll include a number of associated historic contexts that discuss broad themes and trends associated with the history of civil rights in Ohio, covering public accommodations, education, employment, housing, and police relations. Then it also talks about and lays out some parameters for looking at property types. What are the actual types of buildings, sites, structures that are associated and reflect these historic themes? And as we'll see, these are going to include amusement parks, swimming pools, barbershops, beauty parlors, churches, social clubs, fraternal organizations, schools, public housing, protest marching routes. Then the section that's called the registration requirements. In the document, in the overarching MPD document, it'll lay out ideas and ways in which these individual properties that you may be working with and trying to nominate, under what criteria they're likely to fall, and most importantly, how to think about assessing historic integrity. So it'll lay out some parameters that then can be plugged right into your individual property that you're trying to nominate. The MPD also includes a very good list of properties. It's not comprehensive, but it's mostly, it identifies properties that have been mentioned in the MPD. Now, this is again meant to be a context. It's meant to give you some ideas of similar type of properties still existing or possibly gone, and the list indicates that, that you might use for comparison with the property you're trying to nominate. So the list in the back of the MPD is not all properties that would qualify for the National Register. It's merely mentioning, expanding the idea of the historic context. This is the pool of resources that were drawn from and looked at and examined to help inform the MPD. So the whole idea is basically to streamline the nomination documentation for individual properties and districts. So when an individual property is nominated to the National Register, that nomination doesn't have to go back in housing. An example of housing. It doesn't have to go back in and totally restate that history and development of activities associated with fair housing in Ohio and the development of fair housing laws in Ohio. What it will do is talk about the specific history of that property and show how that history ties into those broad themes. So it merely needs to draw out those broad themes by way of association. And again, we will show two examples of actual nominations to help explain all this. So just as a refresher, again, we're talking about the program we're specifically talking about is the National Register of Historic Places. Official list of properties worthy of preservation for their significance in American history, archaeology, engineering, and culture. And the National Register process, nominations are submitted to the State Historic Preservation Office, our office here in Ohio, and then they're reviewed by the staff of the State Historic Preservation Office, National Register staff. Then they're considered, and the state office is advised by our governor-appointed Ohio Historic Preservation Advisory Board, 17 members throughout the state that have expertise in history, architecture, archaeology, or our public members. They encourage, review nominations 4 times a year and then consider whether or not the properties should be nominated. And then ultimately, each nomination is sent to the National Park Service, where it is actually listed in the National Register. So that's, in a nutshell, the National Register process. And again, just basic ingredients. What makes a property qualify for the National Register? Typically, properties are 50 years or older, although with this particular topic, we may be addressing some properties that have a significance that is slightly less than 50 years. And there's ways of accommodating that and addressing those. Significance. For the National Register program, significance is judged through the 4 main criteria, National Register criteria. A, associated with specific events or broad patterns of history or events. B, associated with important persons that reflect a significant aspect of that history or that particular theme. C, properties that are architecturally significant, either as a building type or for their architectural style or for the work of a particular architect or builder. Or D, properties that may have the ability to yield important information. These are typically archaeological properties in nature. And the final essential ingredient is historic integrity. At the beginning of this webinar, I mentioned that this is about place-based history. And that's, in essence, that's what the National Register does. It recognizes places that are significant in our history. So these places have to retain the major important physical features, characteristics, spaces that are present and able to convey their historic significance. And that's what historic integrity is about. And again, we'll lead by example and show some examples associated with civil rights movement in Ohio and talk about integrity. So we're going to walk through the actual African American civil rights movement in Ohio nomination, and we'll walk through the major components of this MPD cover, the associated context, the property types, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the research aids and documentation information that the document shares and helps explain for you as you would prepare an individual nomination. So let's talk about associated historic context. And these big themes, they tie right into a basic component, a basic aspect, fundamental aspect of any National Register nomination. And the basic concept of evaluating a property within a historic context is this: properties do not exist, history doesn't exist in a vacuum. Any historic property, it relates to a larger historic context or pattern of history. So the essence of a National Register nomination is to tell the history of that particular property and then demonstrate how it is important, significant within the areas of significance you've identified, the specific time period, we call the period of significance that you've identified, and within the specific geographical area, local, state, national area. And then how does this particular property you're nominating, how does it stand out when compared to other similar properties? So The MPD will help achieve that through the information it's providing in these specific historic contexts and how they relate to, again, civil rights movement in Ohio. The MPD consists of a broad overview of the state's civil rights movement and then followed by these key sub-themes. The document is not an exhaustive history of Ohio African American civil rights. Instead, it highlights important turning points. It's interspersed with typical experiences from each theme and each time period. It covers a broad range of civil rights in Ohio, including actions taken by individuals, civil rights organizations, and at various levels of government. The civil rights themes of public accommodation, education, employment, housing, and police relations and police brutality are explored in detail with examples of civil rights transgressions, community responses, tactics, and outcomes. The MPD also details regional changes in the state and pace of civil rights changes. Advances in civil rights were not equal in all areas. Metropolitan areas outpaced rural areas, even when legislation was in place that guaranteed equal access in public accommodations and education. Simple urban areas, there were larger concentrations of African Americans, there were more active organizations and resulted in more activism. In the smaller towns and rural areas, this resulted in more accommodations, more parallel institutions often. The overview in the MPD defines some key 19th century Ohio Black laws and then their repeal, and it also outlines some early civil rights laws that were in Ohio in the 1880s that made African Americans equal before the law, outlawed segregation in public accommodations, and also outlawed segregation in public schools. These laws were often ignored or not enforced. It also outlines and talks about the Great Migration, roughly from the 19th century into the 1920s, and talks about how that tempered the civil rights movement, and also the introduction of the Ohio Civil Rights Act in 1959 and the creation of the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, and then introduces the 1964 Federal Civil Rights Act. It also talks about a number of key organizations statewide and locally that were formed and their association with civil rights. So it gives you this broader overview with some information that is essential to understanding what was taking place in the 20th century. In public accommodations, the MPD talks about how this was carried, the African Americans were denied access in many theaters, pools, other sources of public accommodation. And the civil rights efforts utilized Ohio laws, protested the actual business, or created parallel institutions. In education, denied access in some schools, or were denied access to certain educational programming, or some of those facilities were denied amenities, certain amenities. Schools that were built predominantly for an African American neighborhood may not have had a gymnasium or an auditorium. So some of these were challenged through boycotts, picketing, legal action, but then not everything was seen as necessarily a negative. Teaching was one of the fundamental professions for African American women. However, in most cases, they were not hired in predominantly white districts, and so therefore segregated schools enabled more job opportunities. So there are some aspects and nuances to address and consider in interpreting civil rights history. Employment, again, African Americans were often relegated to unskilled jobs regardless of their skill and education and abilities, or they were more domestic jobs. Manufacturing often were the most dangerous or dirtiest jobs, and often were excluded from labor unions. Some of the earliest labor unions formed that championed the African Americans' rights in the workplace were the United Mine Workers and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Black-owned businesses are very important in neighborhoods: funeral homes, barber shops, beauty parlors. These often were then centers of areas that formulated ideas to approach and challenge these laws and rules and and circumstances of segregation. In housing, in urban areas, there often were small enclaves, neighborhoods of concentration of African Americans. Rural situations, smaller towns, African Americans usually lived throughout the town. But we see the impact of restrictive covenants that were segregating housing, and also outright violence such as bombings when there was penetration challenges to those segregated neighborhoods, resulting in legal actions to challenge that civil rights. Also, the MPD discusses the impact of public housing, the impact of urban renewal. So these are some of the themes that are being discussed and explained in the civil rights MPD in a large, big picture way, and then with some specific examples of how these themes were carried out, and most importantly, how civil rights were challenged and achieved in these various sub-themes. I want to also mention, of all these themes, the areas of police relations and police brutality is the most nebulous. Not because there's a lack of examples, but frankly, because comparing present day events to those of the past make it evident that there's been lack of progress. Police brutality includes the use of excessive force, intimidation, unreasonable search and seizure, verbal abuse, and coercion. So the places that are going to be associated with this is where major events reflecting this activity took place. The MPD explores two facets of this theme: the police relations themes and also the institutional and municipal responses to those themes. So property types. What are the actual properties that are reflected through these various themes that are discussed in the nomination? Excuse me, ding, 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 wrong, in the MPD. The associated property types list the most common properties associated with the civil rights in Ohio. Again, it's not an exhaustive list. You may run across a property that's not listed. That doesn't mean it can't be nominated, and it's going to probably reflect in some other aspect through its how you interpret its historic integrity guidance that you'll find helpful in the MPD. Properties have to be successful in nomination. The properties have to be directly associated with the historic event, person, or have the potential to yield future information. Because many properties may have existed for decades. We may be talking about a building that was built in the 19th century, but its significance in its role in the civil rights movement didn't occur until the 1920s or even the 1960s. Understanding how it conveys historic integrity is going to be key to knowing the building's appearance and spaces and over how it looked during the period it was associated with the civil rights activity or significance. Civil rights historic sites are most likely going to be registered in the National Register under Criterion A and Criterion B. Criterion A is going to be the most likely for its broad association with broad themes in civil rights history. Criterion B will be applicable for a person who made a significant contribution to civil rights through legislation, organization involvement, legal action, but often not limited to those. Criterion C is most likely to be used in conjunction with Criterion A, where a historic building was involved in a civil rights event, such as a church or a historic district. Civil rights sites under Criterion C would in all likelihood be a building, structure, or object eligible under A, but also eligible under C. Churches associated with civil rights may be architecturally significant in their own right and are most likely examples. Historic districts associated with civil rights history will also apply under Criterion C as a distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction, or they may also reflect the work of specific African American builders, such as the Myrtle Highfield area in Cleveland, Ohio, that we showed you a picture of at the beginning of the webinar, or associated with particular developers or other key aspects of trying to address the civil rights activities and efforts associated with housing accommodations. So here's just some of the examples of property types associated with the broad themes. And the other key aspect of the MPD are what we call the registration requirements. And this is where it lays out in general terms how to think about historic integrity for properties that you're trying to nominate to the National Register. And the idea is simple. Again, it's very important to know and understand the significance of the property you're trying to nominate, and then you're able to identify key character defining physical characteristics that convey that significance and the specific time and place. The important consideration is going to be an overall sense that the building retains the essential physical features that make up its character and appearance at the time when important civil rights events occurred. And for most of these properties being nominated under Criterion A and nominated under Criterion B, it's going to be important to understand the interior floor plan. Where are the interior spaces that are associated with some of these important event or activities that took place over time in this particular building? And then where did the event take place? How did the property factor into the significance of civil rights history of the property, and what physical characteristics remain? It's just the rest of the themes. A quick word about sources of information and documentation, and this is explained in the MPD document. The registration guidelines suggest corroboration of events within the press, legal system, or civil rights organizations. So it's important to note the distinction between the black press and usually weekly papers published in large cities that had a metropolitan coverage, and the white press. Newspapers and magazines that catered to white audiences usually only covered civil rights events if they caused a major disruption. While they are a way to gauge significance, they often prove to be a poor source for verification of local events. On the other hand, the black press covered such events in much greater detail. Black papers in major cities also covered events in smaller cities and towns throughout the states. Civil rights events were also covered in out-of-state newspapers, and particularly good sources are the Pittsburgh Courier, Indianapolis Recorder, and the Chicago Defender. And a lot of these papers are available online now, searchable online. Magazines that cater to an African American audience also are excellent sources of verification and information. These include the NAACP publications, the Crisis, Ebony, Jet, and Opportunity. National and state civil rights organization archives are often the best source for local verification. There are also local groups such as Future Outlook and League and the Columbus Vanguard League, who have archives and information available in libraries and historical societies. These often record some of these events in their entirety, so you know exactly the who, what, where, and when associated with some of these events. The Federal Housing Administration's internal publication, Insured Mortgage Portfolio, catchy title, but invaluable in regards to federal housing and minority housing. There's often detailed information in this about first-time programs and program location, and also legal cases. A little bit more digging, but often yields some really important information that's going to be helpful. So now let's look at our two individual case studies. As I mentioned, every property being nominated to the National Register has to actually be prepared on a National Register nomination and include all the pieces and parts of an actual nomination. So we're going to look at two examples, the Eugene McKinley Memorial Pool in Portsmouth, Ohio, and the Mance Hotel and Annex in Cincinnati, Ohio. We're going to see one example that has almost pristine historic integrity and one example that does not. So first, let's start with the Eugene McKinley Pool. It's nominated under Criterion A in the area of Black history and civil rights. The McKinley Pool is an example of a pool planned as an integrated swimming pool in a town that formerly had only segregated pools, Portsmouth, Ohio. Construction on the pool was started after its namesake, a 14-year-old Portsmouth youth, drowned in a Scioto River gravel pit because African Americans were not allowed to swim at the privately owned Terrace Club. A coalition of African American residents and white community organizations banded together to raise funds for the pool's construction in 1961. Fundraising languished until '66 when the city of Portsmouth took over the project and completed the pool's construction. So the period of significance begins in 1961 when the pool was officially planned to 1967 when the pool opened to the public. So the nomination covers the specific history of the McKinley Pool, and it places it within and draws upon some of the broad context of the MPD that examines integrating swimming pools and creating parallel institutions. The McKinley Pool actually occupies a complicated position in Ohio's civil rights and Black history. During its construction period, Portsmouth experienced the integration of elementary schools and jobs that split both white and Black communities. While essentially integrated, the pool was located in a historically segregated African American neighborhood. The pool is a testament to both community conflict and an effort to uplift a community within narrow parameters. It also demonstrates the physical representation of a city maintaining the racial status quo, but preserving a town's social dynamic during the civil rights era. While many cities saw private swim clubs constructed when municipal pools were integrated, constructing a municipal pool to protect the private club is much rarer. The McKinley Pool occupies this position. It is an integrated pool that served to protect informal segregation. Conversely, it was also, as it was advertised, A Place in the Sun for Everyone. So the nomination explains that dichotomy and that conflict that existed within the local neighborhood, and again, places it within the activities of civil rights and public accommodations. It doesn't go back through the entire MPD and restate all of that big picture history. It just takes aspects of it and applies it and shows how this particular individual pool reflects that broad pattern of history in a significant way. Integrity. The nomination clearly describes why the pool is significant, and then also explains how it retains its historic integrity. It draws from some of the language in the MPD that describes how a swimming pool has integrity. Some of that notes that the fencing and pavement should mirror the original. The MPD requirements also show the associated buildings and structures at the time of significant event should remain in the condition, their original form, proportions, exterior materials. And then it goes right into saying how all these features and factors are evident in the McKinley Pool House. Basically the pool, the bathhouse, the pump building, they've not been altered since the pool was opened. The lifeguard chairs, the board, the railings all appear to be original. The setting remains the same, a concrete pool surrounded by grassy lawn. So the National Register nomination calls out the specific aspects of integrity for the MPD and then explains how the nominated property meets those requirements. The support materials, it gives the standard required locational mapping, the USGS maps. It gives a site plan that shows the photo views, and it pulls out some historic documentation to help support and explain the civil rights activities that were taking place. To challenge the segregation of the private pool, the NAACP organized what were called wade-ins at the private terrace club pool to begin challenging the need for a public pool that accommodated African Americans and prompted the finishing of the McKinley Pool. So those elements are called out and help to support the story in the nomination. The last one, the case study we're going to look at is the Mance Hotel and Annex. It's significant under Criterion A in Cincinnati's African American social history. Due to segregation in public accommodations, the Mance Hotel and Annex became a destination for African Americans visiting Cincinnati. The hotel was also a popular spot for local Blacks to celebrate weddings and other special events. The hotel provided a meeting place for Cincinnati's African American clubs, fraternities, and sororities. The Mance is also notable for its role in African American civil rights history. It provided a place for national African American groups such as the NAACP, the National Dental Association, National Bowling Association, Housewives Leagues, National Negro Business League, to gather, celebrate victories, and strategize next steps. The period of significance begins in 1931 when Horace Sudoff purchased the building and ends in 1961. And this reflects a period of less segregation in Cincinnati and the taking over of the hotel by Sudoff's heirs after his death. And it really marks the beginning of the Mance's decline as a hotel. The Mance Hotel and Annex is nominated under the multiple property documentation cover form, is evaluated in the historic context of and registration requirements of hotels, motels, and travel lodges, and evaluated within public accommodations in Ohio. The Mance Hotel and Annex nomination clearly explains Horace Sudoff's philosophy and method of overcoming discrimination in Cincinnati. He established the Manse as an integrated facility to serve not only as a hotel for celebrities and dignitaries, but as a gathering spot. The Manse Hotel and Annex also allowed ordinary African Americans to experience a lifestyle usually reserved for whites through its society functions and events. The Manse Hotel and Annex is unique in Cincinnati as a rare example in the state of a Black-owned full-service hotel with convention-type facilities. The Negro Motorist Green Book listed a number of hotels in Cincinnati offering services to Blacks. None are directly comparable to the Manse Hotel and Annex. The Manse's focus in offering ballroom for meetings and conventions separated it from other African American hotels. The Green Book was published by a New York mailman, Victor Hugo Green, between 1936 and 1960. It listed restaurants, service stations, hotels, boarding room houses that welcomed African American travelers. The Manse was listed in the Green Book, I believe, every year it was published, and is one of the few hotels in Cincinnati that still remains and also stands out for the other reasons I just explained. So the nomination clearly compared the Manse Hotel to these other similar hotels and explained how the Manse stood out in the comparison. Integrity, you can see from the photos of the Manse, it's undergone a great deal of change and alteration. And so it was very important to clearly explain in the nomination the significance of the Manse, why it is a fairly rare example, one of the few remaining Green Book hotels associated with the Green Book identification, and its particular role in the civil rights movement in Cincinnati. So knowing that significance, the nomination then clearly articulated what aspects of integrity the Manse Hotel buildings did retain. Their location in Walnut Hills, a very important African American neighborhood, was still intact, and including their neighbor, the Colored Women's Club, Cincinnati Federation of Colored Women's Club, is still right next door. That building is still located there. Interior spaces in the Manse Hotel itself, some of the rooms, the circulation corridors, the ballroom itself, only although greatly altered, that space still exists within the building. And the annex, actually, its spaces and rooms still are quite intact. So the two properties together, the nomination argues, retains historic integrity. Supplemental aspects of the nomination, the Sanborn map was used very effectively to show the complicated building construction history of the hotel itself, showing the various phases of construction that then was detailed in the description in the nomination. Advertisements and historic images. This is an image down below at the left-hand corner of the NAACP National Convention held at the Manse, were effectively used to reinforce the significance of the hotel. And also a historic image was used showing the building as it historically existed with the third-story mansard roof. But again, the integrity then was articulated to clearly show the retaining features that the building retains to convey its historic significance. So we've showed two examples of how the MPD was utilized to help nominate these properties to the National Register. These and similar properties, the entire document, MPD document, will be on a special section of our website, along with some other tips to helpfully successfully nominate properties. A wrap-up is always a perfect reminder of what the National Register does and doesn't do. National Register listing doesn't change a property owner's rights as a property owner. It doesn't require that you fix up your property or open it to the public or does it prohibit you from making alterations? National Register listings should not be confused with local designations that often do put into place local design review. And here's what the National Register does. And we're excited about the prospects that this civil rights multiple property documentation and the nominations that come out of it are going to do. It's going to, certainly we envision it, helping to assist in the preservation of civil rights associated historic properties. We've already talked about how the MPD is going to assist in identification and preparation of future National Register nominations, but once those civil rights associated properties are listed, those properties may qualify for historic tax incentives. They're going to help raise awareness for civil rights and in the African American community and the importance of these properties to the African American community and to the general public. They're going to provide opportunities for additional grant funds, including the ongoing National Park Service's African American Civil Rights Grants, which does include some bricks and mortar potential funding. And they're going to open up additional educational opportunities and bring these properties to the attention of local governments, state and federal agencies for future planning efforts. Just a couple funding sources that are out there available to fund the preparation of National Register nominations. More information is available on our website. More information is available on the Department of Development's website for the pipeline money. And again, we are excited about this project and its outcome. And we hope that this webinar has helped you understand and expand your knowledge a little bit about what the MPD contains information-wise and how that information is going to be able to be used to help nominate properties to the National Register. Thank you for participating in the webinar. Let's get at some of those questions.
All right, folks, if you'll type in over the panel on the right-hand side of your box has the question. If you want to type something in, we've got several already in, my goodness. Okay, did you use the Green Book to help locate African American properties?
Yes, the Green Book is mentioned in the MPD. We have utilized those. It was utilized specifically in the Mance Hotel nomination to be able to establish what the other sites were that were nominated or existed in Cincinnati, and then help to form that comparison that's required in the nomination to determine that many of them were no longer existing.
Okay, there's a question about someone who had trouble logging in. Erica, I'll make sure that you have a copy of the presentation so that you have access to all the slides. So because you joined just a little bit late, this next question, what is MPD?
Oh, okay. Again, the MPD is my shorthand for multiple property documentation form. And that's that cover document that lays out these big picture themes associated with this topic today, civil rights in Ohio between 1900 and 1970, talks about some specific types of properties and then how you would assess their integrity when you go about to individually nominate them.
Okay, and then there's a longer, I don't know if it's a question or comment, but I'm going to read it. Renville has 3 properties that date back to very early civil rights movement, including the church where the founder of the National Urban League and early leader in the NAACP, Adam Clayton Powell, Sr., first began his religious journey, as well as the town hall and the miner's house being restored for a museum. Sorry, my box is small. In this town that was home to many African American firsts in Ohio and the nation, including Richard L. Davis, an early writer of letters that led him to leadership in the UMWA in the late 1800s, and the first African American mayor in the United States. who was also the first African American to receive a medical degree in Ohio, Dr. Isaiah Tubbins.
Great. We've already identified some properties, it sounds like, that should be nominated or considered for nomination to the National Register. And hopefully what this webinar has shown is, again, how this multiple property documentation form may help facilitate and provide that bigger context to show how, if these individual properties in Renville, or if there's a historic district in Renville, how it, how it can be utilized, the MPD, to help prepare the nominations. But again, like I said, individual nominations will have to be prepared for any property. But it sounds like, John, you definitely have some resources down there that we should all talk about and look into about how they would qualify for the National Register.
Will the MPD be available on the Ohio History Connection website?
Yes.
Okay, there's another. Is there an end to the nomination period?
No. Hopefully not. We're here for the long haul.
What was the second paper you mentioned?
I said the Pittsburgh Courier, and there was an Indianapolis.
And the Detroit, wasn't there?
I need to go back to that page. Wait a second, you can read the next one.
Okay, the next question, she'll get you the answer on those papers. Are the applications you referred to available for complete review as examples?
Yes, they will be. All of these are still being considered by the National Park Service, but once they're actually accepted and listed, we'll be further developing that a special page, special section of our website, or yes, that's what it's called, website, and we'll have that these samples as well as other samples, and we'll also have the complete MPD. We'll have some other tips, and possibly we'll figure out maybe if there's some ways we can link or give you some links to some research tools, because our goal is to have that be a source for, again, helping people get started, and a source to go to while they're preparing these nominations. Still looking for my notes.
She's still looking for that newspaper. Any other questions that people would like to type in?
Good question.
There's another one. I have submitted nominations. Oh, here, just we'll have some newspapers.
Pittsburgh Courier, Indianapolis Recorder, and the Chicago Defender. And there are probably others, but again, I do know these were used and are footnoted in the MPD, so they're definitely yielded information that was specific to Ohio circumstances, even though they were statewide or out-of-state newspapers.
Okay, I have submitted nominations and have been asked to cite much of the information to an extraordinary extent by the reviewer. Much of the pattern information you cite as identified in the MPD I had included, but this was not good enough. Please comment.
Okay, I'm not going to be able to comment on the specific nomination because I'm not familiar with it, but again, it's a fine line. I mean, if okay, what individual properties being nominated, they have to be evaluated within a context. So you have to explain what that context is that you're evaluating it in. If it's a local African American history or a specific aspect of historic civil rights, like the McKinley Pool or the Manse. The Manse Hotel talked sort of about the situation, the Black experience in Cincinnati, but as it pertained to the use of facilities like hotels and how those hotels were used. It didn't talk about the entire African American history or schools and other housing. It focused in on African American history and how that played out, civil rights challenges, and how it played out to the development of hotels, and specifically how the development of the Manse Hotel and its place in that history. So a nomination is a combination of big picture issues and explaining the context, but then honing in on how what you're nominating reflects that history. And so it's often much more about the history of that property, but again, the key aspects of that history that reinforce that bigger context. And I think in seeing something like the Manse Hotel, it helps explain it a little better when you can see that. And the reviewer you're working with in our office, they may be able to share with you some examples of other successfully completed nominations, if they haven't already, that can help show just how to utilize that big picture versus the specific history and how to weave them together.
Okay, the next question is, what about Friendship Park in Gahanna, Ohio, was previously a Black country club? What about some of the homes in Worthington that were on the Underground Railroad? Residential enclave in North Worthington, Flint Road, all Black neighborhoods for middle-class Blacks.
Sound like all good candidates. And let me take a moment to explain. If you think you have a property that may qualify for the National Register, and you can figure this out by thinking through this MPD, is my property got a certain age? Do we think it qualifies under a criteria? Does it have historic integrity that shows important physical characteristics from the time period in which it's achieved its significance? And we also, on our website at the Ohio History Connection, under the State Historic Preservation Office, we direct you to our National Register questionnaires, and they're really our first step in helping you pull together what you know about that property, share it with us, and we look at those questionnaires on a weekly basis, and we'll get back to you with our guidance and recommendations as to whether you should launch into preparing a full-blown National Register nomination. So I'm getting excited because I'm hearing some good examples that are out there, possibly ripe for listing.
The next is, I think, some helpful information from Sadiqa. The Call and the Post in Cleveland and Columbus appear to be newspapers, perhaps that were also African American newspapers at the time.
Yes, absolutely.
The next question, in the example of the person who submitted that was not accepted, is it possible to get additional information and resubmit?
Oh, absolutely. And I believe that's the case. I mean, when we review nominations, we will give you advice and some direction. If there's aspects that we think, given our experience with the National Register program, that's going to cause that nomination to run into questions or possible difficulty when it's looked at by that state review board, and also ultimately when it's looked at by the National Park Service. Because our goal is to work with you all who want to list your properties for whatever reason you want to take advantage of the National Register program. But our goal is to work with you to have a successful nomination. So yes, we give you guidance. We may edit the nomination, give you some suggestions, ask some additional questions with the intent that you're going to work on that and then send it back, and we keep moving. It's not unusual for a nomination to have to go through a second draft or revision. So don't get it discouraged.
Are the Heritage Ohio staff available for application review before submission? Well, yes, we would be, but there's no reason, there's no penalty for going back and forth with the National Review staff. Just deal with them directly over and over. That's what they're there for. So certainly we'd help if you think we could provide any help, but do not hesitate to send paperwork to the National Register staff here at the SHPO office. Do you want to follow?
Oh, and I wanted to mention, that's absolutely right. I mean, we're willing to work, we're eager to work with you. And again, that's where that questionnaire kind of comes into play, because you don't need to be fashioning your information in the questionnaire in any particular way or in any particular format. You can basically tell us what you know about the property and includes photographs. And then we can look at that and give you direction. And then when we're telling you, advising you to go ahead with an actual nomination, we'll write a letter, and often we can give you some very specific focus. Think about this, or look specifically at this aspect of this building's history as you develop the nomination. And always the ever popular sample.
So there's another question. Can you share more about the Ohio History Questionnaire? Do you think you covered that?
Well, again, the questionnaire is something we've created here in Ohio because the nomination, I won't kid anybody, the nomination form is a pretty rigorous research document, has very specific requirements in the way of photographs and, as you see, mapping and other things. So if you've got a property and you're just trying to figure out, might it qualify? Is this going to be successful? We'd rather not have you launch into and get, really involved in a full-blown nomination, only maybe to find out that it's been altered to some extent, or there's just some other factor that maybe is not going to really lend itself to its success in a nomination program. So the questionnaire, what it does is actually leads you through a series of questions that are associated with or help you think about applying criterion A, B, C, or A, B, or C. If it's an archaeological site, that's kind of a different topic. But it helps you think about the kind of information you need to know in order to address those criterion, and then you just kind of tell us what you know in the questionnaire. You can handwrite it, you can type it, we don't care. We don't care. Just so we get the information, have some photos to compare it to or look at. And then, as I said, we have a team in our office of staff that look at these every week, and then we get back to you either with maybe a couple questions to clarify or big green light and say, go forward, here's some more information and the more specific directions. Or if at that point we see something of concern or something based on our experience that we just really think's going to cause it difficulty in being successfully nominated, we'll tell you at that point. And then again, you can make a decision, to say, okay, I just don't think this is going to be the perfect fit for me, or, well, by golly, I'm going to give it a try anyway. So
I think it's important for everyone to also understand that the staff want National Register properties to succeed. They're not gatekeepers trying to keep you out. They're looking for ways to get as many through as they can. Another question, are pictures older than 2 years acceptable if no significant changes have occurred? I've seen nominations entered on the National Register as such. Please comment.
Yes, the Park Service, well, the National Register requires that there are current photos documenting the current appearance of the property at the time it's being nominated. So if you have photos that are more than 2 years old, the National Park Service just mainly requires that you verify that indeed is still what the property looks like. And you can do that verbally in the nomination or including a couple more recent photos. But photos that are more than 2 years old can be accepted. Again, you can't submit a photo from 1950 as your current photo, especially if the building doesn't look that way anymore, but within a reasonable time frame. And again, that's probably maybe a question that's very specific to a specific property, so we can help address that more clearly if you communicated with us beyond this webinar about that.
So what assistance is this project providing property owners, or are folks on their own to prepare a National Register nomination? And then it can become part of the multiple listing if it's approved.
Well, again, the whole idea of the creation of the MPD is to cover some of that big picture research that won't be required as you prepare your individual nomination. You'll be able to plug into that, as we've talked about throughout the webinar. From a financial point of view, the project doesn't create a funding source specifically, but I'll tell you, it's never been a better time in Ohio to have actual funding out there available to prepare National Register nominations, as that one of those last slides that we kind of quickly went through so we could get to the questions. There are grants available through communities that are designated as certified local governments, which are communities that have created local preservation programs. There's funding through our office that can be utilized in conjunction with a certified local government to prepare nominations, and those can be done by a third-party organization, and you work with the local government to be the administrator of the grant. There's the Ohio History Fund, organized through our parent organization, the Ohio History Connection, that can include preparing nominations to the National Register. For properties that have the potential for income producing, taking advantage of the state and federal historic rehabilitation tax credits, the Ohio Development Services Agency has created the pipeline grant funding opportunities, which are an excellent source for getting some funding to prepare National Register nominations. And in a bigger picture, the National Park Service, I believe still in the coming year, will have funding available through their African American Civil Rights grant. The same granting source that we receive funding to do this project could be utilized by other organizations to do other related civil rights related projects, or as I mentioned, I think some of that could go towards bricks and mortar, which might go to work being done on some of these properties that are being identified.
Can you distinguish between National Review and Ohio history staff?
Sure. Every state in the United States has a state historic preservation office. And in Ohio, that state historic preservation office, or sometimes it's called SHPO, we're a division of the Ohio History Connection. So for Ohio, we serve as the nominating authority for nominating properties to the National Register. The National Register nominations have to go through be submitted to our office and be reviewed by our state review board at one of the 4 scheduled meetings, and then be submitted to the National Park Service. So if you're out there nominating a property to the National Register, you can't just send it directly to the National Park. Well, you can, but it'll be sent back to our office. So our role is to help you prepare National Register nominations, and the 4 staff people in our department that review nominations, we can't necessarily research and write the nominations for you, but our first initial review of those nominations help provide you with guidance on the aspects in what you've prepared, what maybe needs editing or needs more information, and we just help guide you through that process. And
I think you should also maybe clarify that the state inventory form is not a state registry.
Right, yes. There's also the Ohio Historic Inventory and the Ohio Archaeological Inventory. Those are comprehensive statewide surveys of historic properties. Basically, what their intent is to provide a snapshot to identify historic properties in a community. Some of those properties that are identified in the Ohio Historic Inventory may qualify for the National Register, but they would have to be nominated to the National Register. Having a property documented in the Ohio Historic Inventory, that's merely what it does. It documents that property and helps inform somebody that there's a historic property. It doesn't have any kind of benefit associated with historic tax credits or any type of necessarily any local design review or anything like that. It's merely a really basic level of documentation of what historic properties are and where they're located within a community that then hopefully jumpstarts more robust, more involved preservation activities like nominating them to the National Register.
Does Heritage Ohio plan on linking the MPD to the Department of Tourism for further utilization of Black History tourism promotion? Sadika, that's a very cool idea. I think that, it sounds like a great Humanities Council grant to me. And I will tell you, Heritage Ohio has been working with tourism on historic theaters. So I think that that would be an interesting thing to work on. Come on over and we'll talk about it more. The next question is, what is the procedure when the nomination reviewer comments become too technical? For example, parenthetical citations versus footnotes.
Again, I think we're talking about a very specific circumstance. And again, guidance may just be merely explaining the readability of a nomination. If you have footnotes referencing your sources, especially if your footnotes or your references are very complicated, it's a lot more readable if they're footnotes at the bottom of the page versus a paragraph, in parentheses after a sentence. So again, I can't really speak to your specific circumstances, and I'm happy to talk with you or talk together with you with your reviewer in our office, but it sounds like you've got some very specific questions with a particular property, and we're happy to help talk through that with you.
It sounds like there are a lot of resources I'm unaware of, like the existence of the Ohio Historic Inventory. Are there lists and links on the Heritage Ohio website to assist generating submission or ideas? Well, I want to clarify that Heritage Ohio is the nonprofit that supports advocacy for historic preservation, and Barb, who's giving this presentation, is with the State Historic Preservation Office, and she'll address those links that they do have.
We have a searchable database, National Register database on our website, in which you can type in a city like Renville and see what's listed in the existing in the National Register, or Columbus or county, or you can plug in a certain name and see if it's properties listed in the National Register, and then PDFs of those nominations are available by contacting our office. We also have an online mapping service that there's a public version that you can access and hone into communities or counties or areas of the state through a GIS mapping, and it'll show you areas that have been documented with survey and with National Register. And then again, you can come to our office, look at the forms, or contact us for copies of those forms.
And I'd really encourage people to do that, make an appointment, because the file records, I'm a paper person, but I love going and reading the National Register nominations, the original nominations, the site inventory forms. They have files and files of that information, and it's really just a fun time if it's something you're interested in. So that is all. Just a second. Since it sounds like there are multiple people presenting, when the phases of our website is mentioned, when the phrase our website is mentioned, oh, which website are you talking
Oh,
about?
I'm sorry. When you hear my delightful voice, Barb Powers here, I'm sorry. When I talk about our website, it is the Ohio History Connection website. And then specifically the section under Preserve, and you'll find State Historic Preservation Office. That's where you'll find all this information I've been talking about the National Register questionnaire, the information about historic tax credits, funding sources, and the Ohio Historic Inventory.
Thank you so much for everybody who attended, and Barb is certainly accessible, 614-298-2000.
Call now.
Call now, right. So I want to thank everyone for attending today. Our next webinar will be in July. It will be on wayfinding, and in August we have a webinar on bikeable communities. Please watch the Heritage Ohio website and watch for our e-blast, and please feel free to contact any of us. I'm Joyce Barrett. You can write to me at jbarrett@heritageohio.org, and we'll try to answer your questions and make sure you're finding the resources you need. Thank you so much.